Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining us now, Anna Clark, reporter at ProPublica, covering issues in the Midwest and also the Flint, Michigan water crisis. I know that we have talked about it in the past, and I had said that you'd been covering it about 10 years. I guess it's a little bit less than that, but nevertheless, your reporting has, you've continued to report on a national level where I think, a lot of people have forgotten about the Flint water crisis and its implications for around the country and the awareness that it raised in terms of what's the problem with our older infrastructure. I believe it was in the IRA where there was a significant money earmarked to replace lead pipes around the country. But remind everybody what happened in Flint, because I think there are people who frankly have forgotten at this point. And it's interesting to look at Michigan today and the politics in Michigan today and what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, it is really striking given what a spotlight Flint was in for a while there, how there's still now a lot of, confusion about some of the basic facts about what actually happened. But it's true, 10 years ago this spring, there was this now infamous switch. The city of Flint, Michigan had been receiving water through Detroit's water system for more than 50 years, which comes from Lake Huron. And the city, which was then under a state-appointed emergency manager's authority, so no local control, fully under the state-appointed management authority, they decided they were going to leave Detroit's water system. They were going to reboot the old plant. They were going to use the Flint River for a couple of years as just a temporary solution, and then move on to yet another water system that was still under construction, where they'd still have to treat their own water. Things went very poorly. They didn't treat the new water source properly. They didn't monitor it properly. The old water plant didn't get the staffing or resources it needed to really make sure that people had safe drinking water every day. And there was also a disastrous lack of transparency as things started to go badly. And even when residents were noticing a lot of issues with their water and its effect on their skin, their hair, their at-home infrastructure, they had an extraordinarily difficult time getting their voices heard by officials at every level of government. And also, a lot of other people who should have been paying attention sooner, including us journalists, universities, environmental groups, all that. So anyway, what's happened is that in addition to being exposed to toxic levels of excess lead, but they were also exposed to bacteria issues, a disinfection byproduct that can be very unsafe at high levels, and a 2-year outbreak of legionnaires disease, which was not made public at the time, but is what actually killed some people. At
12
least
people, I think it was, right?
And that's the minimum number, because this wasn't exposed at the time. A lot of health professionals weren't looking for it. Frontline did a really great report that suggests that a lot of folks who died of pneumonia at the time might have actually had legionnaires.
I just want to take a moment and focus on how this was an incredible failure of democracy, right? Mm-hmm. Because you have Governor Snyder. At the time, I think that it was who it was, right? It was Snyder. And he appoints essentially the government for Flint. And Flint is a big city. I mean, it's like I think at that time, around 200,000 people, maybe 180,000. And I mean, that's the size of Worcester, Mass, second biggest city in New England. I mean, it's a decent sized city. And to basically say there is no elected official who is accountable. And that's where you have this incredible breakdown in terms of how responsive that government was to these complaints. And it also, I mean, I would also suspect that because there was this sort of supposed streamlining of the government, that's also how come you had the failure at the water treatment plant on some level, because they don't have to listen to anybody. And so the water treatment guy is there and he goes, hey, wait a second. I know how to treat the water coming from Detroit. I don't know how to treat the water coming from this source. It's a whole different ball game, essentially. And no one has to be responsive to this because their job relies on one person, the governor, who is, essentially like made it clear he's not going to listen to anybody else.
Well, what you're saying is, yes, like this was such a crisis of governance. Like under the last administration, they expanded Michigan's use of this emergency manager system to intervene in distressed cities and school districts. And it was, most states have some mechanism for this, but it had unusual authority in Michigan, and still has. This law is still on the books. Wasn't
there a referendum to get rid of it, and then the Republican legislature reinstated it?
Very good memory. This is 100% true. This is there was this law was instituted. Then there was a ballot referendum to remove it. That referendum won by a large margin across the whole state of Michigan. So including, communities that were not going to be subject to this threat, thought that this was maybe going too far. And then, the lame duck legislature quickly rewrote a very similar version of the law that now had appropriations attached to it, which made it referendum proof. And then it went on to be used quite widely, most famously perhaps in Detroit, ahead of its bankruptcy. That was going on at the same time as a lot of these major events in Flint were happening, which I think probably contributed to the delay of people taking what was happening in Flint as seriously as it deserved to be treated. But Flint was the first one that got one of these emergency managers under this expanded system, and they had a series of 4 of them for about 3.5 years. So key decisions made in the switch of the water system, in how it was handled, as, problems, red flags started emerging, delays in responding seriously and in a systematic way to resolve the problem. All of this, I think, prolonged people's suffering. And as you said, Flint is a large city. At the time, it was the 7th largest city in Michigan, though it's, of course, very famous for depopulating. At its peak, it was about 200,000. At the time this was happening, it was about 90-some thousand.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize.
But still, that's 90-some thousand people.
90,000 is still a significant size city. And
government, it's a major hub. I think people sometimes forget what a very full and robust city Flint was and still is.
Let's talk about the implications of, lead poisoning. Certainly, we outlawed it in terms of paint. There are all sorts of rules that we outlawed it from gasoline. There's a lot of people who suspect, and I don't know if I subscribe fully, but that the crime rates across the world actually dropped about 20 some odd years in the wake of outlawing leaded gas in various places. And we can see it both internationally and nationally because it is a neurotoxin. Anywhere, back in the day you worked in a lead factory, it was known as I think they called it the crazy factory or something to that effect. People were aware that this is a neurotoxin, and it doesn't take long particularly for kids, if they're ingesting this through the water, for it to show up. Do we see the implications of that now, 10 years out? And I know that within a couple of years, there was an increase in special needs students. Hard to see the direct causation here, but what is the sense that, I don't know, epidemiologists have or health officials have about this?
Yeah, very good questions. And I appreciate how you noted how lead exposure can happen in many different ways, because that's part of what's really insidious about lead is that it's cumulative. If you absorb some of it from lead paint that's still remaining in your house, if you get some lead that is in the soil from as a legacy of like the leaded fuel era. If you also are getting some from through your water because of not just lead pipes, but corroding lead pipes, which is what Flint was dealing with. This adds up, and for it doesn't have like, what makes it very tricky, as you're saying, is that it's hard sometimes to show like this immediate cause and effect on an individual basis. If you are lead poison, if you are going to, have some like really negative cognitive effects or developmental effects, sometimes it may not show up for years. And as the sort of merchants of doubt over the 20th century would put it, it could have been anything, it could have been anything. Right. So you really got to look like population wide to get like a good assessment that shows the very true, very real toxic effects of lead as a pattern. So as you can imagine, a lot of folks have been paying attention to like what, how things have fared in Flint. And the good news is that at least, like so far, I don't think on a community-wide basis it's had like as disastrous of effects as I think some people feared. But the effects are real on like a number of bases. Like there's, as you mentioned, there's upticks in special education needs for many students, like especially boys, according to the study researchers who did it, like drops in math scores. There's been a lot of like interventions that have been trying to both intervene, like remediate possible effects of lead. So this may also be helping reduce the worst of the negative effects I think people have feared, including, health registry programs, nutrition programs, expanded healthcare that I think meets a lot of different needs people have had. I do also want to say though, like, well, of course, children are most vulnerable to the toxic effects of lead, and those kids are still just growing up. So I think there's still a lot, remains to be seen, a lot remains to be known. Adults too, are not immune from effects. It can have reproductive issues. It can have kidney, nervous damage issues. A lot of this stuff is just like super hard to measure, especially when there was so much misinformation at the time and people might not have known to get certain things checked. Right. Health professionals might not have looked for certain things, and makes it difficult to have like a true assessment of the total health toll of this. But whatever it is, it should have been zero. None of this should have happened. This was entirely a man-made crisis. And as you said at the top, like it isn't just Flint's story. It's a story that I think we need to learn from in all corners of this country. What has been done? I mean, just remind us of the various attempts to get some type of justice, remediation, and compensation. I mean, I know there was a tort action that was won, but I'm reading it wasn't paid out. Tell us about that. But also just remind us, I mean, I remember Snyder was on trial for this, and I think he got convicted. And then if I remember on appeal, he was found not guilty. But walk us through this, because it's there are so many people who are, I feel like, both responsible in causing it and also have some responsibility in not addressing it. I mean, I remember Barack Obama even going and drinking that glass of water and saying it's fine now. And, it may have well been fine for a 50-year-old man or a 55-year-old man to have one glass of water. You're probably not going to feel any dramatic effects after that, but that's not what we were talking about. Yeah, that particular move came about, 7 months after Flint was switched back to Detroit's water, but the pipes were still corroded. I just want to remind people like why that happened. No, is because the way that they were treating it, they had to treat it differently, the Lake Huron water, and they did not know that this would interact with the pipes. And so you're basically getting these lead pipes are corroding because of what the water treatment plant is putting into the water to keep the water safe.
Um,
Well, it's sort of, in fact, like what they were putting into the water, which is interesting. And this was being supervised by the state environmental agency. So this is, so that like Flint hadn't been treating its own drinking water in more than 50 years. And so now they've got this rebooted plant that's like not as equipped as it could have and should have been, to treat a more complex water source, which any river would be. It's just a more complex water source to treat. And among the things that they didn't do that they should have done is they didn't treat it with corrosion control. And this was breaking federal law. This is a law we have that's effectively an acknowledgement that we have aging pipes all over this country, and many of them are made of this dangerous neurotoxin that is not safe at any level. And to attempt to minimize the effects of that, you're supposed to treat it with corrosion control to help keep the pipes from corroding and breaking down into it. So by not treating it with corrosion control as they're legally required to do, and then having this naturally more corrosive water source pass through the pipes over a prolonged period of time, you end up having the pipes break down. So even when, at long last, after tremendous in work by a lot of the activists in Flint and some key allies, they finally got to the point where they were able to switch back to Lake Huron water through Detroit, which they were told was impossible to do, but they finally did it. But even that didn't, quote, end the crisis, because then you have this like breaking down infrastructure, right? That's how you got to deal with, which is expensive and complicated for even well-resourced cities, right? So this brings us, kind of jumping forward a little bit, like how do we assess accountability for all this, right? You mentioned the class action lawsuit and some of these like criminal charges. Like first, the class action suit. This was the largest class action in Michigan history, was announced in 2020. It's about, at this point, the settlement's like $626 million. It does have a lot of things going for it in that it prioritizes, for example, children who would be most vulnerable to the crisis, people who are eligible who aren't just residents, but anyone exposed to the water. So maybe like college students commuting in, kids who went to school there but didn't live in the city. There's like lots of, so I think that's really good. But like it has been now 4-ish years, and to date, no one has received anything from it, and except some lawyers and contractors who got some preliminary payments. So they've got something so far. But Flint folks who filed a claim in this class action are still waiting, and there's really no idea when anything would come through for them.
Who was the defendant? Was it the state?
Yeah, this is the state, and a few others entities have paid into it who that ends their potential liability. So some consultants and, I believe McLaren Hospital, which is where some of the legionnaires issues, kind of happened, so there was, so a few different people, but mostly the state have paid into this pot.
And I assume there's a committee being like established, or that has been established, that is basically creating some type of algorithm to determine how much each individual gets based upon certain criteria. I was this age, I was this close to exposure, I had this disease, that type of thing.
And there's so many different like kind of categories, and getting paperwork for everybody. It is genuinely like complicated. So there is, you gotta acknowledge that, but it's also been very messy. And, folks in Flint will point out that, there's people who move, there's people who die, there's people who like, you want to get the fact that like some lawyers and contractors have already been paid something, like kind of like twist the knife a little bit on that. And the other thing folks have been really waiting for is like, some kind of accountability. Because again, none of this had to happen. It could have, there's a lot of other choices that could have been made to prevent this. And even if it did happen, to have ended it much sooner. There were 2 different criminal investigations. One started under the Snyder administration by his attorney general. And then when the current administration with Attorney General Nessel was elected in 2018, there was a new one that started. So like when Nessel came in, The previous cases that were still pending were dismissed, and she's like, we're with special prosecutors, we're going to start all over. We're going to draw for more evidence. We're going to really get through this. So the public has paid many millions of dollars for both the prosecution and the defense over many years that led to many high-profile charges, including, as you said, the former governor, and including the head of the health agency, including 2 of the 4 emergency managers. But not one case made it to trial. The most recent prosecution ended because courts dismissed the use of a one-man grand jury to get indictments. And that's it. It's done.
Right. Well, Anna Clark, we'll put a link to your piece at majority.fm that you've written for ProPublica. Thanks so much for catching us up on this, and I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your questions and for giving attention to this beautiful city of Flint.
All right. Thanks.